Who's Bond? James Bond.
I know who you are, what you are, and why you come. You have made a mistake.
The situation for James Bond seemed grim in the early 1970s. George Lazenby was a bit of a dud with audiences and decided to walk after only one film. Sean Connery had left the role and was enticed to come back, but only for one more. 1973 would see the introduction of yet a third actor to play Bond, and like before, there was a lot of speculation as to who would wear the shoulder holster. Cubby and Harry returned to seek out old favorites like Michael Billington and John Gavin, and it's from this pool that they found their man, Roger Moore. Moore was well known as a TV star, and yet it seemed destined that he would land the role at some point. He had been in the running for a while, allegedly even being considered as far back as 1962 for Dr. No, and even played the character of Bond in the TV show Mainly Millicent for a comedy skit. Upon completion of You Only Live Twice, Moore was actually being talked to about doing a version of The Man with the Golden Gun, which was to be shot in Cambodia, which ultimately ended up never happening. He was good friends with Cubby and Harry for years, and after a second season of his current show, The Persuaders, fell through, he was quickly scooped up by the producers. Much of the same creative team from past films returned, most notably Guy Hamilton and writer Tom Mankiewicz. Guy was reluctant as he didn't want to be stuck only doing Bond films, yet the gauntlet was thrown down when the producers offered the challenge to make a successful Bond film without Connery, and Hamilton found that he couldn't refuse. The venture paid off, as not only did the film end up making more money than Diamonds Are Forever, but despite critical reviews being mixed to somewhat positive at the time, Live and Let Die went on to become one of the more popular films of the series with general audiences. The plot starts off with an intriguing sequence where 3 agents are killed in suspicious circumstances while trying to investigate Dr. Kananga, the ruler of a Caribbean island called San Monique. James Bond is sent to New York, only to find himself in a web of danger and espionage. With the help of Felix Leiter, Bond finds out that there is a connection between Kananga and the mob boss known as Mr. Big. After this revelation, he travels to San Monique to get a closer look at Kananga and his mysterious accomplice Solitaire, who has the power of the tarot and can foresee Bond's efforts. Bond has to wade through the cloud of illusions and magic in order to discover Dr. Kananga's larger plans and how to thwart them. Live and Let Die carries over some of the lighter tone of Diamonds, as well as trying to return to its espionage roots. A lot of the film is infused with a great sense of misdirection. You don't know who all is on Bond's side, and you're left wondering who is just around the corner trying to kill him. The filmmakers wisely decided to abandon the original novel's plot of sunken pirate gold and try for something else. On this most recent viewing, I noticed plenty of connections between this and Dr. No, some of which I had never noticed before. Beyond the obvious of both films introduce an actor as Bond and are set in the Caribbean, both films start with a mysterious set of deaths, both feature Bond's home in some capacity, and that scene involves having sex with a woman before leaving on a mission, both feature several attempts on Bond's life, one of which involves an animal. There is both a driver working for the villain and a female that Bond beds before revealing her deception. Both feature a man named Quarrel as a key ally along with Felix Leiter. And finally, Dr. Kananga and Dr. No share quite a bit in common. They are both absolute rulers in their respective domains that use superstition to enlarge in their images. I noted in my Dr. No review that Bond's quip comparing the man to a minnow pretending to be a whale was accurate. Here, Kananga is using voodoo mysticism and theatricality to instill fear into the locals, accomplishing much the same idea. I'm not sure how intentional this was, but I found it fascinating to see that this film took elements from Dr. No and reused them in fairly non-intrusive ways. I wouldn't call Live and Let Die a remake of that film, but perhaps a bit of a remix. Guy Hamilton was determined to fill this movie up with plenty of entertaining scenes and performances, so that if for some reason you didn't like Roger as Bond, you'd still have enough left over to have a good time with the movie. However, that's not to say that Guy shows a reluctance in adapting the series to a new actor. Both he and writer Tom Mankiewicz do a great job of making Moore a clear contrast to Connery. Much was made in the press at the time about Roger taking over from Sean, and the filmmakers were keenly aware of this challenge. Roger's Bond still carries over what he should from Sean's, and yet it feels like a new emphasis on the same template. Roger is far more quippy, approachable, and perhaps a touch more mellow. If you walked into a room with Sean's Bond, you wouldn't know whether he would try to kill you first or charm you. Roger would definitely go the charm route before killing you if he had to. The gentlemanly aspect of the character was highlighted, and I have a feeling this is more what we would have gotten if David Niven had been allowed to play Bond in a serious film. Now, that's not to say that Roger himself was entirely farcical or out of touch with the pulse of the series. On the contrary, he has his darker moments too, and doesn't shrink from indulging on his darker tendencies if the occasion makes it necessary. He feels like a valid reinterpretation of the character, and I think both Moore's and Connery's portrayals are logical takes on the same man. It'll take until The Spy Who Loved Me before the style of Moore's Bond was completely cemented and found its groove, but this was a great first try. I've always had a fondness for Yaphet Kotto as Dr. Kananga. Various interviews and stories have stated that he was difficult to work with, which is a shame because I think Kananga is one of the better bad guys we've encountered up to this point. He's quite calm and collected a lot of the time, and yet can become mean and loud on a dime. He feels like a dog with bite, and I would actually be somewhat scared of this guy if I ever ran across him. I'm not as enamored with his Mr. Big persona, although that might be due to our lack of time with him. I do appreciate that Kotto clearly plays him as being different to Kananga, so the deception is a bit more plausible, though I don't ever recall being surprised to learn that they were one and the same. This film just has a great cast of villains. I've said several times before that the three films that have the best overall cast of bad guys are Goldfinger, GoldenEye, and Live and Let Die. Even henchmen that have no credited name like the taxi driver are memorable. Teehee captures the similar balance between fun and menace that Kananga does. The hook for a hand is a nice idea, and I love how it gets used throughout the film. He also gets to continue Hamilton's weird fascination about having a baddie come back for the final scene to have one last shot at Bond. Perhaps the biggest impression is made by Geoffrey Holder's Baron Samedi. He perfectly plays the character with a tempered offering of the outrageous behavior that Samedi is known for in voodoo folklore. Plus, his being involved with the secret society of the government run by Kananga is right in line with his seedy reputation. I think the fact that he crops up throughout the film at various points and never seems to have direct involvement with the other villains during his scenes adds to his mystique and intrigue. By virtue of potentially surviving the film, he instantly sticks in people's minds like Oddjob or Jaws, and it makes a lot of sense that he'd be a popular choice for multiplayer in several Bond video games. Gloria Hendry's Rosie Carver is the weak link of the villains, but I think that's intentional. She's putting on a show for Bond at being a fairly weak operative, and I think that's a fine idea, but we never get a real look at the true persona underneath because shortly after Bond calls her out, she runs off in terror because of a scarecrow and gets killed. She never really comes into her own, and so when I think about this film or great secondary Bond women of the series, Rosie never comes to mind. David Hedison's Felix Leiter is a marked improvement from Norman Burton's. He seems like a competent fellow field agent of Bond's that just happens to be playing politics for this outing. His and Bond's chemistry might be because Hedison and Moore were friends in real life, and I think it's a shame that this is the only Moore film with Leiter. Most of the allies for the next 6 films come off as fairly forgettable with a few exceptions, and given that Moore even returns to America for a few of them, I'm curious as to why Leiter never reappeared. I'm glad that Quarrel Jr. was included in the film, and I appreciate that nothing is really made of his probable parentage. It's just a nice Easter egg for fans. Sheriff J.W. Pepper is clearly here to add more fun to the boat chase, and I do enjoy Clifton James a lot. His presence is welcome for me because the chase seems to go on for an eternity. It's filled with great moments, including one of the best stunts in Bond history, but because of the narrowness of the canals which inhibit the type of action we can have, and the fact that nobody is shooting at each other during it, I started to get fairly bored with it soon in. Finally, let's talk about the question mark of the cast, Solitaire. Jane Seymour turns in a fine performance, and I love how enigmatic she starts off being. Her regression towards being fearful after she loses her powers helps to give us a glimpse inside her head, and I appreciate that she feels like one of the more realized characters of the Bond women so far. I just wish she had a chance to redeem or reassert herself against Kananga, as she plays like more of a passive bystander through the second half of the film and doesn't contribute that much. The reason I call her a question mark is because of a couple of questions I have regarding her involvement in the story. She seems to be helping Bond after they sleep together, as she leads him to the poppy fields. Yet she turns on him at the airfield. Is she still on Bond's side and just giving him an opening? Or is she betraying him and running back to Kananga? I originally assumed that Kananga would have written her off as Bond's accomplice, so the henchmen should be surprised that she comes back over. That makes sense to me because Kananga later directly asks Bond if he slept with her, meaning that he must have suspected that Solitaire had turned by that point, and he had already found her unclear interpretations disturbing before, so he might have started to count her as a loss. But several people have commented on some of my other videos claiming that they read it as she was clearly taking advantage of the moment and helping Bond escape the airfield rather than returning to Kananga's fold. But if she's not acting on Kananga's orders, then why doesn't Kananga punish her in some way before the scene with Bond and the watch? And if he does, why don't we see or hear about it? Another question I have comes up earlier in the film. A tarot card is sent to Bond at breakfast, warning him about Rosie's true allegiance. I assume we're supposed to think that that was Solitaire, except that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Why would she be helping Bond at that point? She knows that they're meant to be lovers in the future, but she doesn't seem to want that to happen anytime soon. So what prompts her to alert Bond now? Both of these story points are hugely distracting to me, and if someone is willing to enlighten me on them, I'd highly appreciate it. When I reviewed Diamonds, I said that the production value felt like it had taken a step back from some of the earlier films, and I suspect that was due to Connery's salary. Here, the value is about the same as it was there, and yet it's less distracting. Maybe that was because the film has quite a few more action beats than Diamonds, and most of them are quite a step up, so I'm not left staring at the background as much as I did there. I already talked about my issue with the boat chase, but seriously, that stunt is remarkable. I also have to give a shout out to Bond jumping over the crocodiles. The setup is fantastic. Bond is left alone on the island with pieces of meat around him. He gets the idea to use his magnetic watch to bring over the canoe, but it's tied up. I'm so fond of this moment, by the way, because we've never really seen one of Bond's gadgets fail to get him out of a situation before. But this leads to one of the coolest things Bond has ever done, and it's a moment of movie magic. Ross Kananga, the man who owned the crocodile farm where the filmmaker shot at, volunteered to do the stunt himself, and naturally it took several tries to get it right, and some of the outtakes are breathtaking. I also love Bond's escape with Mrs. Bell at the airfield, and the small bit with Bond driving a car from the back seat. Speaking from a personal perspective, I've actually had several nightmares about being forced to drive from the backseat of a car, and I wonder if this film contributed to that at all. I feel like Guy Hamilton is putting a little more effort into this one. There are several great images throughout, and the scenes usually serve one of three things: the story, the atmosphere, or the action. In that sense, the film is much closer to Goldfinger than Diamonds. For example, there aren't as many explosions in this that typically seem to be in a Bond film, but I feel like I'd rather have great stunts throughout than save most of the action for a grand third act. The final fight between Kananga and Bond does feel muted, but the film doesn't lack for great action elsewhere, and I kinda like this change of pace from some of the other films. Not everyone needs to end with a big gunfight, and this is the first one since Russia that doesn't feature something like that in its climax. Speaking of the finale, I'm a bit disappointed that Bond's watch suddenly has a buzzsaw feature. Now, I like the idea, but it comes out in the moment, and I feel a little cheated because Bond is one step ahead of the audience here in a way that he isn't throughout much of the rest of the film. The music is an indelible part of the experience. Sir George Martin steps up to the challenge after John Barry couldn't return, and it helps the movie to feel like a declaration or a statement rather than just another verse in the long-running poem that is this series. The funky influence with the orchestra helps to give this film a color and an edge it wouldn't have had otherwise. As much as I love Barry's regular work on the series, I don't think I would have described most of his scores as being edgy, and thus he probably wouldn't have turned in as unique of a score as Martin does here. Plus, while I'll continue to rave about Majesty's and Diamond's scores, upon re-listening, I did notice that some of the tracks start to feel like they could have belonged to either film. And thus it seems like Barry was naturally starting to feel some creative fatigue after doing so many films in a short amount of time. What was probably most immensely helpful to Martin was having this excellent title track by Paul and Linda McCartney. This is one of the first songs that comes to mind when general audiences think of Bond, and I think that's entirely understandable. It became the first official Bond song to be nominated for an Oscar, and has remained one of McCartney's most well-known songs post the Beatles. There's a lot of information available about the production of this film, including an entire book written by Sir Roger Moore himself, and I think it was because the public was very interested in seeing another actor take a stab at Bond. Sure, we had Lazenby by this point, but Roger was a well-known TV presence and many felt like it was only a matter of time before he played the role. And Roger talks very fondly of his time as 007 and has been one of the great ambassadors for the series. He even took time to record commentaries for each of his Bond films for the Ultimate Edition DVD releases, and those commentaries have carried over into subsequent releases. Do yourself a favor and listen to them if you haven't. He has a remarkable memory and is very interesting to listen to because of his more relaxed conversational way of doing these. He doesn't reveal much about the production history that you probably don't already know, but he shares fun stories and connections that he had made along the way. By the way, he says that after The Spy Who Loved Me, Live and Let Die is probably his second favorite of his run. And the rest of the world seemed to like it as well. Audiences were fairly warm towards Roger, and Live and Let Die broke a fair few records, including the record for the most watched broadcast film in the UK when it came to television in 1980. I've done a little work on looking up the box office totals for each of the Bond films and adjusting them for inflation to see where they would come up now, and I feel like that might make for an interesting topic sometime down the line. For example, Live and Let Die made $161.8 million at the time, but when you adjust that for 2023, 50 years after its debut, that would put it to just over $1 billion. The film also tends to come up when people just list Bond adventures from memory, and I think that says a lot about how it is connected with audiences. As for me, Live and Let Die is just fun to watch. It's not my favorite of the series, but it has such a feel that is remarkably different from other Bond films, and watching it in chronological order with the rest, I feel like there's a renewed sense of creativity after the play-it-safe entry that was Diamonds Are Forever. As much as I have a soft spot for all of the Bond films, there are definitely ones where you can feel that the series is going through the motions and churning out standard issue orders. That's not necessarily a problem for me because I like my standard issue Bond, but it's nice to come across one that puts in a little more effort. And yet, I wouldn't say that Live and Let Die is a top-tier film. It just tries to be a quality adventure and a great showcase of all the classic Bond elements, and it succeeds for me in that respect. Roger makes a solid debut performance here. The cast of villains is terrific, I like the feeling of danger and mystery surrounding the film, a lot of the action is genuinely good, and I always tap my toe to the soundtrack here. I just feel like it falters a bit when it comes to the finer details of the story, and bits and pieces could have been trimmed. Yet, despite this seeming success, it did not mean the Bond series was guaranteed to survive. And much like James seeing sharks behind him on the waves, Cubby and Harry had to be careful not to let their ongoing troubles sink the series beyond salvation.